Hello, fellow Ag nerd. Thanks so much for joining me. My name is Tim Hammerich, and every week you and I get to hear from the founders, farmers, innovators, and investors, the people shaping the future of the ag industry. And I've got a little bit of a different episode for you here today. It's just me, no guest, and I thought it might be a good time to just check in and touch base on some things I've been thinking about when it comes to the future of agriculture. In the literal sense, the future of agriculture, but also in the sense of this podcast, kind of why I do this and what's my framework for thinking about the future of agriculture. Now, this idea to do this episode came from a keynote I was able to give last week. This was for the 4th annual Soybean Research Forum and Think Tank in Indianapolis. Really enjoyed visiting with those folks there. They brought in a cross-section of farmers, researchers, and people from agribusiness and ag tech to talk about kind of the future of agriculture. So it was such a fun group, and I really enjoyed putting together and delivering this keynote. So I thought I would take kind of the Cliff Notes, a very abbreviated version of that keynote, just one section, and use it for today's episode because it has been a long time since I've sort of shared with all of you who listen every single week how I think about the future of agriculture. Now, and as you know, I don't call myself a futurist. I don't exactly even know what that means. I am not any sort of fortune teller. I have no sort of ability to predict the future whatsoever. I think that's probably obvious. So the question remains, like, how should I think about the future of agriculture? How should you think about the future of agriculture? And I think maybe that begs the question, why should we even be talking about the future of agriculture? I started this podcast 8 years ago to try to get a sense of what was happening in ag technology and some of the things that were happening on the fringes in agriculture that I thought were stories that weren't being told. I saw some ag tech media talking a lot about fundraising. I wasn't so interested in that. And then a lot of traditional ag media, maybe more lifestyle focused or kind of the same conventional topics being tossed around over and over again. And I wasn't seeing a lot of media when it comes to what was happening in terms of innovation on the fringes that might be a bigger part of the future of agriculture. And that's the thesis that's carried through 425 episodes to where we are today. That's why I wanted to do this. I have changed a lot from at that time owning a recruitment company to now today doing more consulting with ag groups on the marketing communications side of things. So we deal a lot with industry relations for commodity groups. And like I said, I do some speaking and get to do these podcasts for not only myself, but others like the Almond Journey podcast, Growing Pulse Crops, Soil Sense, The Business of Blueberries, SWAT Agronomy, and others that I get to help out on as well. So it's weird to have a career now that focuses mostly on podcasts and has branched into other strategic communications, but that's where I am today. What I'm getting at, though, is that the podcast, the through line of the podcast has always been what's happening right now that might give us a glimpse into where agriculture is headed. And I think it's important to think about that for how we make business decisions, what opportunities we pursue, and for some major challenges that the world continues to face. And I'm not talking about just, feeding the world as the tired narrative goes, but I'm talking more about agriculture is looked to not only meet our most basic needs, but also manage our resources. And we see that now in the midst of climate change, when it comes to ecosystem services, when it comes to nutrition, a lot of the biggest problems we face, agriculture needs to rise up and help us solve for. And it always has done so in its own way. And the expectations around our agriculture system, our food system, just continue to grow greater and greater. And meeting those challenges is something I find inspiring, a little bit daunting, but interesting every single week. So I appreciate you tuning in with me as I explore these stories. That's going to continue. That's not going to change. But I have evolved the framework I use for thinking about the future of agriculture, and that directly informs the content that you hear each and every week. So I thought I'd share that framework with you here today. Right before I do, though, I think there's some risks in anytime I talk about the future of agriculture. I told this to the group last week because anytime I show up to a group that doesn't probably have any context on me or what I do, and they hear that I'm going to talk about the future of agriculture, I could just hear the eyes rolling in my head as they read that, because there's some risk, right? The first one being buzzwords. Anyone who wants to show up and talk about the future of agriculture is probably going to use a number of words that basically mean nothing, like sustainability, well, a lot of artificial intelligence. It's sort of these words that we're all going to talk about, but we don't always define because sometimes we don't have a great definition for. Regenerative might fall into there. Innovation is one of those words, and I use that word on every single episode of the show. So there's the risk of just kind of falling in the trap of buzzwords. I do try to avoid that, and I do try to ask guests what they mean when they use a buzzword on the show or to further define it, but there always is that risk. The second risk is what I'll call the risk of the Tomorrowland effect. I took my kids to Disneyland in May, and it was a really special experience. Was a once-in-a-lifetime experience for them, or at least that's what I keep telling them, because that's probably the only time we're going to do the trip that we did. But one thing I found funny at Disneyland is there's an area called Tomorrowland. You've probably seen it, and it looks like if you ask the average person in the 1970s what the year 2000 was going to look like, these are the ideas they would have. It's flying cars and it's the Jetsons, and it just looks kind of a dated version of what the future might look like. And anytime I talk to people about the future of agriculture, we run that risk of talking about these things that are so far from reality that sure, maybe they'll come true in the future, but we won't be alive to figure it out, right? The future is a long time and we'll be dead for most of it. And so I try to avoid anything that is so far-fetched out there. We're going to be farming on Mars because it just seems kind of pointless to talk about. Now, it's can be fun to think about science fiction, but that's sort of, I think, another show, not so much this show. The last risk that I run whenever I talk to groups about the future of agriculture, when I talk about it on this podcast, is people thinking that I'm ignoring the current state of the agriculture industry and the current challenges that we face. I thought it was really interesting when Spencer Stensrud was on the show a few weeks ago, how he talked about at Ag Ventures Alliance. I was complimenting them on, hey, because you're farmer-led, farmer-driven, you're going to really focus on today's problems and the problems of today. And he said, yeah, that's true, but I worry more about missing the moonshots, about missing the things that don't necessarily meet an immediate need, but are going to be the industry movers of the future. I thought that was really interesting because one of the risks of talking about the future of agriculture is to totally ignore what's going on today. Today, we have a really, really tough farm economy. In row crops, we've got lower commodity prices. We've got high costs of inputs due to kind of inflation. We've got high interest rates. We've got high farmland values, high cash rents. It's an economic squeeze out there. In some cases, we have not great crops headed our way this year as well. So I don't like to ignore the fact that there's current economic headwinds facing farmers today. But I will say that it doesn't come up every episode of the show because oftentimes we're thinking about the longer term and the longer view. And in my opinion, economic challenges, even if they are short term, just emphasize the need for more innovation in agriculture. And I don't want to gloss over the fact, though, that it is important to consider the state of the current farm economy. Anyway, those are the risks, right? You got the buzzwords risk, you've got the risk of Tomorrowland, and then you've got the risk of sort of ignoring the present. So if you can just acknowledge those with me and move on, I want to get into the framework for how I think about the future of agriculture. The first one is, if you've ever been to any industry event and they talk about the future, this is what they're going to focus on, and that is current trends. So where is the trend today? How is this year different from last year, different from 10 years ago? Where does the trend seem to be going? We saw a trend reversal when it comes to venture capital funding for ag tech and food tech, or to use the word that I hate, the worst buzzword of all, agri-food tech. We saw a trend reversal, right? Up until 2022, it was going up and to the right almost every year, and it dropped by something like half between 2022 and 2023. So where's the trend? And this is where data becomes really, really important. I like the show to be a data-driven show for this reason, is what's the data telling us about the current state or the current trend, whether it's tech funding or whether it's sustainability, adoption of cover crops or something like that, or whether it is the global markets for agricultural commodities, whatever the case may be. I always start with kind of where's the current trend. So that's the first part of the framework there. That's not going to surprise anyone. That's not really novel. Pretty much that's how everyone thinks about where things might be going, is where have they been going? And right along with that, I like to look at the history of agricultural innovation. Those of you who've listened to the show for the past year know that it's become an increasing part of my interest, is finding stories from the history of agriculture, specifically the history of agriculture innovation. We had William J. Morse on an episode last year. Then we had Carl Bosch of the Haber-Bosch process, Cyrus McCormick, and then the episode I did with Jeanette Barnard about the beef bonanza of the 1800s as well. Those have been extremely informative and a good reminder that, number one, innovation takes time, that innovation happens as a result of several different people working together, but usually there's a core group of people who are just so insanely committed to the outcome that they continue to drive a collaborative effort. Another big lesson from those has always been a lesson of mentorship. You look at William J. Morse's boss, Charles V. Piper. You look at Cyrus McCormick's dad, Robert McCormick. If you look at Carl Bosch's boss, Heinrich von Brunck, all of those, there are clear signs that mentorship helped to drive and direct the efforts being made for some of the greatest agricultural innovations of all time. Also, what can't be ignored about the history of ag innovation is there's usually an external catalyst that really takes that innovation to the next level. So even though William J. Morse had been working on the soybean for years, and there started to be collaboration coalescing in the 1920s, it was World War II when all those efforts sort of came together to more than double production during the war. Similarly with, Haber-Bosch, it was both World War I and World War II, where there was really big investment into large-scale Haber-Bosch facilities. World War I specifically. Cyrus McCormick, Civil War, we went from 90,000 mechanical harvesters to over 250,000 just in the span of the Civil War alone. So those are all war examples, but I don't think it always has to be war. As you've heard, if you heard those historical examples, I wonder if the current interest in climate smart commodities is a social catalyst for a lot of the innovations we've been talking about. Time will tell. We've got IRA funds going into climate smart agriculture, and I guess we'll see what the result of all that is, if that does, ultimately serve as a big catalyst for ag tech and digital ag innovations. So, that's the second part of the framework, is what does history tell us about ag innovation? So the first thing is, what are the trends? What are the current trends? Second thing is, what does history tell us about ag innovation? The third thing, and this I already mentioned on this podcast because it has been the theme of this podcast from day one, is what is happening on the fringes right now that could become mainstream later. That's why I have so many startups on here. Most of the startups I have on here don't have a large market share. They're operating with a small group of, maybe beta users or maybe a small group of customers. What feedback are they getting from those customers that might indicate to us this could be something that achieves broader adoption? Going back to the history examples, innovation takes a whole lot of time. So I think it's worthwhile to look at stuff that's happening on the fringes. Maybe it's, somebody who's finding value-added ways to capture more of the farm dollar. Maybe it's, a tech-type product like, who's one we've had on recently? Like maybe a carbon robotics that is, doing laser weeding, and maybe that's going to catch on. Or maybe it's a company doing something interesting like Syngenta hiring their team of soil scientists to really make soil science a core competency of a large scale input company. Anyway, those are all things that happen on the fringes. They don't tend to make headlines in other places, but I think it's an important part of the future of agriculture, an important part of my framework for thinking about where agriculture is headed. So that's number three, is what's happening on the fringes that might become more mainstream in the future. And the final part of my kind of future of agriculture framework, what I think about, is what is true today that might not be true tomorrow. This is something that I think about quite a bit. You hear people talk about black swan events. What could be true tomorrow that is not true today, or vice versa? What's true today that might not be true tomorrow? This isn't the first time I've mentioned it here on this podcast, but this idea of deglobalization, the most impactful book I've read in the past year has been Peter Zion's The End of the World is Just the Beginning. And it's talking about demographic trends of basically population plateauing followed by population decline in many countries, and combining that with geopolitical factors that make the U.S. less likely to be the world police for things like commerce and for things like conflict. And if you combine some of those trends, you start to picture a world where we reverse course on globalization to get to what we call deglobalization, which is instead of relying on constantly growing demand from people around the world because there's more and more people wanting more and more things, there is a lot of uncertainty out there. There's fewer people in certain countries, and there's more uncertainty of getting goods to them. So there's less incentive, less demand for these products that are traded globally. So if today the truth is globalization and tomorrow the truth is deglobalization, that is a major shift. That is a catalyst for a changing agricultural system, a changing food system. The implications of that, I think, are profound. I don't know all of them, to be honest with you, but I think that something like that is worth thinking about, of how that could impact the future of agriculture. You take other things that we take for granted. Right now, our farming system is based on the fact that farmland values only go up, right? Because since the 1980s, they basically have. And since the beginning of time, overall, the long-term trend is farmland real estate only goes up. Well, if you take, a period of deglobalization, maybe that becomes untrue. And what happens when we start to lose faith that farmland only goes up and you have a lot less buyers? Maybe some of you out there listening who farm are like, been looking for that day so I could go acquire some more land. Others might say, oh man, I'm leveraged to the gills because I think farmland is only going to go one direction. But things like that have a big impact in the ability to change. Obviously, policy would be right there as another factor that could change. We're working on a farm bill now. I don't see that having a big impact on anybody listening to this podcast, but you never know what policies could come down the pipeline and really make a big difference. Other things that, could be along with policy is regulation, right? Where maybe we enjoy products today that will be regulated away tomorrow. We've seen that in our past, of various products that farmers rely on and use that either get limited or taken away. Things can change. So that's the last part of the framework. So here it is, 4 questions I will pose to you that I continuously pose to myself that inform which guests we want to have on the show. Those 4 questions are: what are the trends today? What can the history of agricultural innovation teach us about how innovation happens? Third is what's happening on the fringes in a small amount that could have the potential to go mainstream in the future. And then the 4th is what is true today that might not be true tomorrow. And then I'll just add one more that I've been thinking about a lot lately. I mentioned my favorite book of the past year was Peter Zient's book. Probably my favorite book of this year, of 2024, because I read that one last year, is Morgan Housel's Same as Ever. So here's your bonus framework question, which is: what is unlikely to change in the future of agriculture? There are certain things that just don't tend to change. I'm not saying that we should bias ourselves to thinking things won't change, but if you read his book, it's really interesting to think about the future in the context of what won't change. I encourage you to go check that out. He also has a great podcast where he talks about some of these things as well. Those are the questions that power this podcast. Every interview I bring on is some variation of one of those questions that I'm trying to find out for myself and share with you so that all of us can position ourselves to meet the agricultural needs of the future. Wherever you exist on the value chain, whatever you nerd out about most when it comes to agriculture, I think those questions are worth having on the forefront of our minds, and they will continue to inform where this podcast goes from here. So I hope that framework is in some way useful. I don't want to make this podcast too long because really those are the things I wanted to say, those 4 questions. And with a bonus question, I think, to consider as well. I'll just give one quick plug in here for those of you who've stuck with me solo for so long. I am doing more of these speaking events and really enjoying them. So if there is a message that relates to anything you've heard on this podcast that you'd like to see at an upcoming event, reach out to me. I would love to visit you all in person, speak with your group, and talk more about the future of agriculture. I really enjoyed being in Indianapolis last week, and looking forward to doing much more of this. But with that, thank you so much for your time and your attention. I do not take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.